Your source for everything paranormal. Para-X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para-X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Merry meet and blessed be, heed the words I call to thee. Honour the old ones in name and deed, hearken not to others' greed. Pray to the moon when she is round, luck with you shall then abound. Respect the earth, the sky, the sea, as you will it, so mote it be. Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron on the Para-X Radio Network. And now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to the show. And tonight the cauldron is really going to get stirred up well. Really got a good one for you. My guest is author Mark Stavish, and he's here to talk about his new book, Egregores. And that's where the opening music comes in, because it was called Watchers by Midnight Syndicate, and it's spot on. Because in this case, in case you've never heard of an egregore, they are the occult entities that watch over human destiny. So, Watcher song works out really well. Mark is a respected authority on Western spiritual traditions. He's the author of 26 books published in 7 languages, including The Path of Alchemy, Kabbalah for Health and Wellness, and is the founder and director of the Institute for Hermetic Studies. He's appeared on radio and television shows in major print media, including Coast to Coast AM, the History Channel, BBC, and the New York Times, and I'm very glad he's with us tonight. Hi, Mark, and welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Oh, this is going to be fun. I like it. As I told you before, I'm anxious to jump right in. Because, I was familiar with thought forms, I was familiar with tulpas and the like, but I had never heard about an egregore. And when I got the book and peeked at the back cover, now I figured out why. Because you say that it's one of the most important but little-known concepts of Western civilization. And, it's showed up, in spite of the fact that it showed up in the Tibetan Buddhism, Islam, modern esoteric orders like the Order of the Golden Dawn, the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, followers of Aleister Crowley. How could that egregores have been overlooked by so many for so long?
Well, it's like anything that we're around and we're comfortable with. We tend to ignore the obvious. Mm-hmm. And I like to jokingly say, egregores, or the definition of it, shares a great deal of commonality with the Supreme Court. One of the Supreme Court justices comments on pornography. It's difficult to define, but I know it when I see it. And Yeah. So, and of course, then the joke is, what the guy down the street likes is pornography. What I like is erotica, fine art. So there's that aspect too. People say, well, I'm not really an egregore. That's not really one. But if we look at it carefully, we see that egregores are pretty easy to define and they're pretty easy to notice. And what will happen is when people realize that they're being exposed to it and that the influence it can potentially have or may actually have on them, a lot of them recoil in denial and fear. And that's where we run into those issues. Now, almost all of your listeners are familiar with the notion of the ancient cults. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what were these ancient cults? Okay, they were having rituals and they were offering sacrifices. Well, who were these sacrifices going to? What were they for? This wasn't just a symbolic offering. These were literal offerings. Sometimes even human offerings were done over the different decades, or excuse me, the centuries, and we've seen that. Mm-hmm. So what is it that's being fed by those sacrifices? Human, cattle, otherwise, or just through extreme asceticism. Okay? Mm-hmm. So then you get the question, so within the ancient world, you have this notion that there was kind of a conduit between the visible and the invisible worlds. Right. And that conduit constituted a kind of collective entity or egregore. Now, sometimes the egregore is known as an individual entity or being. There's that aspect too. But, we'll kind of just wrap that into this definition for the sake of our listeners to keep it simple. Okay. So you have this conduit of energy that exists. Well, where is it existing? Well, in the community, okay, in the city, in the state, in the empire, in the individual cults themselves, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, people identified with this very strongly because the belief was there was a give and take. As long as we take care of the gods, they in some way will take care of us. Now, let's flash forward. Mm-hmm. All of your listeners are familiar with the notion of the Jungian collective unconscious. Mm-hmm. This notion that there's collective consciousness, or what would that be? Would that be conscious I? Is that the plural?
I like that. Yes, let's make it
the
that.
Conscious I. Well, for us, we'll call it that. So you have these individual consciousness or group minds, groupthink that occurs. And everyone likes to think, and I shouldn't say everyone, that really is not true, but we see it often, that they're not involved in groupthink. It's always the other guy. And hence my joke earlier about what the Supreme Court Justice said. The other guy's involved in groupthink. Not me. I'm a free thinker. I'm independent. Well, that's why we have the typical audience, the marketing profile, your typical consumer, your average student. Okay? Mm-hmm. People fit into these definitions, if you will, and they often don't know it. And you see that there are different notions of collective consciousness or collective thinking or groupthink, whether in the ancient world, in the magical, in the occult, in the religious sense, as we would call it today, or even today in the social, political, and economic, in terms of business and employment sense. So that's where we can begin to start with this notion of egregores.
Okay, well, so they differ from other types of conjured entities in the sense that it takes a group of people rather than one to create it. They don't need to be conjured because they can manifest over time through sheer awareness and acknowledgement by large groups of people. And you don't even need to be consciously aware to participate in the creation of an egregore. So, I mean, that's a little scary in a sense, if you want to look at it that way. Because it would seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, I hope you do, that everybody has one or two of them hanging around, don't you think?
Oh, you got half a dozen.
All right.
you have half a dozen to a dozen. And that's okay, because some are stronger than others, some are weaker than others, and you can begin to get out of the ones that are most difficult for you. When we think of egregores, we often think of them, that group think, getting back to that definition, primarily in terms of our religious and political involvements. However, you can see that families can have a group think. Anything you're involved with, schools, the old school mascot and reunion day and all that kind of stuff. Your PTA can have one just as your local bowling league can have one. But whether or not that collective entity or that collective groupthink is part of or feeds into, I mean, to some degree, well, we can argue it always does, but it can be so nominal as to be meaningless. Some kind of spiritual entity on the other side is really where we're getting into the difference between the ancient world and the modern. And I think you really nailed it when you said that the thought form, the collective thought form, does not have to be something which you consciously create. It just is going to happen on its own in certain ways whenever you get a few people together. We hear in the scriptures, when two or more are gathered in my name, I will be there in the midst of them. And that's the notion, two or more. Like we said, it's not one person, it's two or more, and it's what in my name. It's wrapped around some focal point. So, Coca-Cola has its own egregore. Any of the groups that you're involved with, any of your listeners who are involved with their different, whether it's a coven or a ritual circle or meditation group, they, to some greater or lesser degree, will have their own kind of collective group mind. And sometimes they'll manage that well, but often they don't. And that's, another part of the discussion.
Yeah, we're going to definitely get into that. But I want to say that, we were talking about several different types of egregores, and we do need to kind of straighten that out so people can really get their head around it. So let's give the example. There are corporations, there are shared ideas, there are nations, there are spiritual or other groups and beliefs, like you just said. And I think that people are going to perk up when I say this in the chat room. They are also, it has to do with paranormal entities and experiences. Like, it's possible that many of the paranormal experiences we have, such as maybe NDEs or alien abductions, may very well be the result of a collective consciousness thought form. And
yes, very much so.
Blame it on the ghosts or whatever, blame it on the spirits.
Well, I think that's where we get into some really technical issues. And Jacques Vallée, of course, I hope your listeners are all familiar with him, one of the grand old men of UFO research. He came to the conclusion, after having gone through all of these French and American files and reports, that the problem with UFO research is that it was always a blind alley. You could never wrap your head around it, and that a lot of these entities were not from elsewhere, meaning outer space, but were from the in-between-where. Hence that famous statement in Indiana Jones, the fourth movie, they're from interdimensional beings, and that's Vallée's phrase, I believe, because, of course, he was the advisor on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So you have this notion that these beings interact. Now, the question is, at what point does our thinking about them or just doing certain things feed them or attract them? And there's some if you look at some of the early writings of, and this is across the board in many ways, across different systems, but whether it's the early Christian writings or some of the early, even the Indian and other writings, the notion is that basically if you're being a decent human being, you don't have much to worry about. Okay? That, your karma will be there and will work itself out, but in terms of influence from other beings, these invisible forces, if you have a good practice, a solid practice, you're pretty much going to be all right. Okay? Now, of course, there may be some exceptions to that, which we could always talk about, but, if you look at your environment, who your mother always said, it's the company you keep, dear. It's the company you keep.
Yes.
In Buddhism, it's, the Buddha, the Sangha, with the Sangha, the group of practitioners, the Dharma and the Sangha. The teacher, the teachings, and the group of practitioners. Who are the people you practice with? And this is something that's terribly important to the neo-pagan community today. It's incredibly important because it is, let me say at the risk of their wrath again, it's a disaster, okay? And it can be fixed. It can be. But it's about really paying close attention to your purpose. What are you really there for? And what are these people bringing to your group? And what are you bringing to a group? So it's about conscious decisions in group involvement. And that's really when I talk about egregores, that's really what we're talking. These are social control mechanisms. They affect us, how we interact socially with others, and then even with ourselves. So we begin to shape ourselves like the people we are around and the ideas they hold.
Oh, good. It's time for spring cleaning then, because we're around a lot of people that we don't necessarily want to be around sometimes. But so there are good ones, there are bad ones. Can we just kind of inadvertently get sucked up into one that may not be something that we would like prove of, or maybe, all right, so maybe we think something is really, really bad, right? And a lot of people stress, and they sit and they talk and they complain about this bad thing over and over and over again. Can we get sucked up into that kind of an egregore because we're just overthinking it or thinking it too much?
Well, you have several things going on there. Is you got the misery loves company factor.
Mm-hmm.
And if people like to pretend they know more, and then they do. But it's their lives demonstrate that, not their actions. And when people are sitting around the water cooler or their coffee break or the bar after work or, their little coffee clutch and complaining, that is generating a lot of negative energy. Now, that is going to go somewhere. That's going to feed something. Something will feed off that. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the egregore or the collective consciousness, if you will. It's very easy to notice this, okay, when you just think of where you go. If you go to the library, that has a certain feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
You go to a strip club, that has a certain feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now pick the other places you go. Why do you like to go to certain bars? They can be nice bars.
Places that you're comfortable in. Yeah.
Like your neighborhood place. You got friends down there. Or certain cafes.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you go there? Because it may not even be for the food. I don't even care about it. It's just there's a certain feeling that you like.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have to pay attention to the emotions, to the feelings of the place. We always talk about spirit of the place. Well, that's a big part. What is the spirit of the place? I had some folks here 2 weeks ago. We had the Institute for Hermetic Studies had its annual conference. Mm-hmm. And I had some folks here early, and we had a great day ahead of time. And part of that involved taking them to what is said to be the most haunted house in America. Mm-hmm. And I took them there and, saying the neighborhood and everything. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then we talked a little bit about it. And then we went about 3 blocks away, and I took them to this wonderful Lady of Fatima Grotto. And it's right there on this rocky hillside on the middle of an urban area. It's at the top of the college I went to and my son goes to. Mm-hmm. And there it is. This is on a busy street, but you walk in there, and that busy street is just like white noise. Mm-hmm. It doesn't bother you. The place is very peaceful. Yeah. And then you walk up the steps, and they have this wonderful, statues, okay, and it just is very quiet and very peaceful. And I see people praying there all the time. Now, that creates, again, that's tapping into an egregore. That's creating one. It's tapping into it. It's vivifying it. And it has a very definite feel, a place of peacefulness. Okay? Mm-hmm. Then afterwards, we went to this wonderful shop in the area where they opened up this Harry Potter bar. And the place has filled with all this kind of, goth stuff and, buy your animal bones and lots of taxidermy and dead things for sale there. And it's all kind of very kitschy, soft Satanism. Okay, now that has its, it's a sales pitch. It's a kitsch.
Right. Yeah.
There's I almost said trophy mom. Maybe that's what it was. Soccer mom in there in front of me with her kids getting coffee at the Harry Potter bar. So it's that has a feel to it.
Yeah.
It's not. I've been to hardcore Satanist places. This isn't it. This is just guys selling stuff and having a good sales pitch.
It's all for show. Yeah.
And it's fine. So it's next to the Dairy Queen, so we go get ice cream afterwards. So we look at these 3 places, and each has its own feel, and each is actually, we can say, has spiritual entities attached to it, whether you want to believe it or not. Mm-hmm. And so do most of the places that your listeners go to and that we do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kat in chat brought up something interesting, too, when we were talking about the feel of places. And she said, or comfort level, which is not necessarily always a good thing. So maybe, if comfort level is maybe too comfortable, or maybe we ignore things at the comfort level because we're just so busy being comfortable. But
Well,
that's a good point.
Well, that's when we're talking about social control mechanism, where your comfort level is defined by the egregore, and you say, well, I would never go into that place. I'm afraid of that place, whether it's the shop or the house or the grotto, whatever it happens to be. So you can notice that if something is triggering your rejection, your strong aversion, that in many ways is your preconceived notions, your prejudices kicking in to some degree. It could be a warning. It could be a legitimate warning. I'm not saying it isn't, but most people generally aren't under physical or psychic threat. Okay, most of the time. So it just happens to be, I don't want to go there because this is going to make me think differently than I normally do, which may make me act differently than I normally do, which may actually help me reflect on my life in a way that I think I do but don't really, and suddenly everything comes undone.
And you don't want to know, yes.
and it really is that simple. I mean, that's how it works. We call it the thin edge of the wedge under the door. It starts with a thin edge, and then suddenly the door is pried open.
Yeah, exactly. A question, I think you did allude to this, but the question from the chat is, so do you equate egregores with Jung's collective unconscious?
No, it's not an equate. That's an aspect of them. Because egregores can be created and destroyed.
Okay.
They have a life cycle. They exist in duality. I'm sure the collective unconscious exists mostly in duality too, but there might be another aspect to it that I'm not aware of. So, but they share a lot of similarities in how they function. But an egregore is a collective entity. So, you destroy the collection of people. You destroy the things that bind it together. You get rid of its symbols, and that no longer has a connecting point between the visible and the invisible.
Mm-hmm.
Or they can just die out if it's a family line. Families can be egregores.
Wow. See, I mean, that's the thing. It's such a broad spectrum of what could be, what can't be, all the examples of what they are. Not many samples of what they're not, actually.
Well,
because they're probably most everything, right?
Well, yeah, they are. It's kind of simple. All egregores are thought forms, but not all thought forms are egregores.
Okay.
Because your thought form for a better house or a different relationship or new job doesn't necessarily involve a bunch of other people, or isn't necessarily their vision, their cosmological vision. But when you get involved, and I use the examples mostly of spirituality, religion, and politics, and even entertainment, then you're involving large groups of other people.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the chat room. Can they be destroyed due to neglect or shunning?
Never shunning, because shunning is still a negative emotion. You're still feeding it in some way. In fact, one of the psychic spies, I was told, one of the easiest things to find is what you're trying to hide, because there's so much energy put in trying to hide it.
Right.
So, shunning is still an attachment, a powerful emotional attachment. But it's just neglect. You just don't feed it. It goes away over time.
Okay.
They can be revived. But think of it like a balloon, or that terrible, holiday decoration on somebody's lawn. Like that looks like an inflatable cigarette man or whatever it is.
Ew, yes. Ew, okay.
Yeah. You just turn the fan off and they deflate, fortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But if you had to, you could, pump it up by hand, and eventually get it going again.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, all right. So give us a little bit of backstory, some historical background about egregores, because they do go way, way back to ancient times.
All of the deities have them. All of the ancient deities essentially have and are an egregore. And according to what we were told historically, the ancient Roman priestcraft, and of course this would probably be many of the priesthoods in the area, would fight these battles symbolically. We would think of it symbolically with models, that is, no models, prior to actual military engagements, and that was an effort to engage the egregore of the enemy. I was told by Pat Zalewski that Enochian chess, in many ways, is the very same thing, where you're actually attempting to move the energies through those pieces. It's not just a game, but it's an actual talismanic game in which the energies involved, if done well, would actually be moving in some fashion. Mm-hmm. That's what we're talking about. So then, of course, anything that involves the religious activities of the different groups over time would form egregores as well. And all of the gods are. That's why we have to be very careful about the gods. And people want to worship these ancient deities as if they're just symbols, but they don't really understand what that means. Mm-hmm. So when you worship the different deities or take them in through devotional practices, which is their primary source of food, is your emotion, your devotion. Mm-hmm. You're connecting to that. So make sure it's healthy for you. And then, of course, by the occult revival of the late 19th and early 20th century, groups like the Golden Dawn, the different Rosicrucian groups, the different Martinist groups, these all had very potent egregores behind them that were being revivified as well as created.
And they were written about a lot. I mean, H.P. Lovecraft, for example. I mean, this is probably where modern times started to hear that phrase, or started to at least realize what it is.
I don't know if I have to check what I wrote. I don't believe if Lovecraft used the term. I don't know that. But his writings...
Well, that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah, his writings exemplify a very fine example of something that just doesn't die. It doesn't go away. Mm-hmm. And why is that? He wasn't terribly famous in his lifetime, but after his death, he's continued to grow and to particularly take on influence in the occult community. Mm-hmm. There are many writers in the last 10 years, particularly, who have looked at the writings of Lovecraft because even though he denied it and claimed to be an atheist and a materialist in every fashion, we know that he was exposed to a variety of occult writings and mythologies in his childhood. Yeah. And he stated, I do not write these things. They are my dreams, they are my nightmares. They come to me. And that's what I'm writing, my nightmares. So the belief is that he was actually tapping into something, below this threshold of normal consciousness, that he was tapping into these other energies. Now, then some will say, well, did he just not understand them and they were terrifying to him? Or were they truly terrifying? Were they maybe something ancient, or were they something Krupathic? Who knows? That's for people to discuss and maybe at their own risk experiment with to discover. But just that being said, I just received last week a review copy of a book that addresses the use of Lovecraftian notions in its rituals.
Interesting, yeah. I think we touched on this too. Question from the chat room. Any relation with egregores and Tulpa?
Yes, in a way. And this is where we get into Alexandra David Neal. Now, there are many people who like to dismiss her. I'm not so quick to do that because she was there long before many other people were. And there is, weight to back her up. If it wasn't for her explorations of Tibet and Bhutan and Nepal and China, a lot of the Tibetophile, to coin a phrase maybe, activities of the 60s and 70s would never have happened. And then we would never have seen the explosion in Tibetan Buddhism in the West that would occur in the 1980s and 90s to the present. So she's a very important figure, along with Blavatsky. And both of them need to be studied and understood very carefully. Now, when David Neal wrote, she talked about two things. Now, most of your listeners are probably familiar with the notion of a tulku, which is a reincarnation. And this is where I was talking about family lines. This isn't limited to just Tibet. Some Tibetans were surprised when I told them that. This isn't as limited to them. You see the same thing mentioned in Mark Adams' book, The Game of Saturn, in which we see the notion of Italian families from the Renaissance, basically making a deal with the demiurge to constantly reincarnate in the same family line. Okay? I'm familiar with that practice among some folk practitioners in Pennsylvania. Okay, so this is by no means terribly uncommon, limited to a small group, or something of the distant past. This is a very real belief and practice. Okay. Now, whether you believe it happens or not, that's up to you. But I'm telling you, these people firmly believe in it.
Right.
So, that said, the tulpa is essentially this sort of the same thing. It's a magical, we use the term magical creation or energetic creation. But the idea is, and she talks about how her thoughts took on form and others could then begin to perceive them, and then it took on its own semi-independent existence, and she had to get rid of it. It passes the duck test for egregore. Okay? When you look carefully, and I've talked to different scholars, and Tibetan scholars can be painfully difficult because they do like to work in a bubble. The whole notion does qualify. If we use the duck test, does it walk like a duck, quack like a duck, and everything, then we see those practices do qualify for an egregore. But again, not all thought forms are an egregore, but all egregores are a thought form. They require the mental and emotional input to be sustained. But may not reach beyond the individual level.
Okay. And again, the major difference is I think tulpa takes one and egregore takes many.
Yeah, pretty much. And the tulpa may only be your concern,
Right.
Ironically, and I just discovered this in the last month or so, I went online looking for some hypnotic induction programs for a client. And, of course, how it is on YouTube. You start with one thing, you get to another. And there is a stunning amount of, really, we'll just, for the sake of the listener, questionable hypnotic inductions out there. Okay? And many of them are specifically designed to put the listener in a very submissive and obedient state, and to connect them with, specifically, it clearly states this is not make-believe, okay, spiritual entities. Now, will it do that? Yeah, it's a numbers game. It's a crapshoot. You listen to it once or twice, probably not. You listen to it 10 or 20 times every day, a month, maybe. After a while, you knock on the door enough, pretty soon someone answers. And if you have thousands or tens of thousands of people listening to this same practice or this same tape, particularly with the erotic overtones and suggestions that are involved, now we get into the notion of the real psychosexual aspects of energy. And that is something that is part and parcel of the tulku, or the practices that create a generation or a genetic line, if you will, moving forward. But you see, so these things overlap a lot. They're not always distinct and clear-cut.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, there's a really good question that just appeared in the chat room. So clear your head, because you're going to have to think really hard on this one. Or maybe not.
Okay.
Anyway, we'll be back in 2 minutes, guys. Hang in there.
Don't go away. There's more Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks right after these important messages.
Are you haunted by shadow people in the middle of the night?
Do you secretly love all things creepy and spooky, enjoying ghost stories and horror fiction from the best storytellers?
Do you have a true ghost experience you want to share, but no one will believe you?
If yes, listen to the professionals on What Are You Afraid Of? Horror Paranormal Show, Friday nights at 9 p.m. on Para X Radio and at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com.
What Are You Afraid Of on Para X?
Our creepy and demented hosts are on call to provide you with all your spooky needs with true ghost stories, interviews, indie music, and new horror fiction.
We are ready to scare you.
Para X. From Haunted Road Media comes an exciting new novel by author Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Two lost souls, ripped apart by murder in another century, find each other again in the present, only to discover that the murderer has followed them through time. Can their love save them, or will history repeat itself? Find out in this captivating new novel by Marla Brooks, Soul Connection, A Deadly Obsession. Available now on Amazon.com and at BarnesandNoble.com.
Demons, vampires, werewolves, skinwalkers, all of this and more, Sunday nights at midnight on the Staring Into the Abyss radio show. Come, get lost
Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Welcome back to more Cauldron Stirring, and if you've come in late, my guest is author Mark Stavish, and we're talking about his new book, Egregores. Now, the question I was going to threaten you with earlier, it's from Cece. She says, so off topic, then a tulpa could be a doppelganger, but an egregore could not unless it was mass-focused effort. Yeah?
Oh, I'm sorry. What was that? Okay, so a tulpa could be a doppelganger.
Could be.
Okay,
But an egregore could not unless it was mass-focused effort.
Doppelganger, define that for me so I'll make sure I'm using the right definition. Yeah, that's a shadow double. So is that actually a ghost? I mean, is a doppelganger actually a ghost, or is it an astral shell? Because if it's an astral shell, that could be vivified into into an egregore. It can be also vivified into a guardian. You know, and that, well, generally you actually try to entrap or entice the entire consciousness, but then there are practices that you do for that, but it could be a guardian, and that could then that would need to be fed. Yeah, so you would then need to have an egregore, essentially a feeding around it of some kind. It needs energy from somewhere. So it's usually going to be more than one person. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from chat is I just lost it. Oh, can emotions be egregores?
No, but emotions feed them. And you can also then create a feedback loop where your emotions get manipulated by the egregore. Mm-hmm. Your emotions get manipulated by the collective notion. That's what politics is all about, and religion. And you can tell that's the manipulation, why I abuse your goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, that's what's required. I abuse your goodwill.
That makes sense. So what kind of impact does an egregore have on an individual, their destiny, and their free will?
Well, it has everything, because if it's a healthy egregore, it'll help them move along in their life path. Like, they can be with a nice company, they can get a good job, they can enjoy their career, they can move on, they can express themselves and bring unfoldment to their life. If they're in a healthy religious or spiritual environment, the same true will happen. If they're in a healthy family environment, the same true will happen. But if that egregore is not healthy, it can detract from it. And that's where you see some people get so obsessed in their occult studies that they let their lives go to crap.
Mm-hmm.
Or they get so caught up in thinking they're going to save the world. The world doesn't need saving.
I think we do.
And that's the thing, you can only reinvent it in your own image. So if you don't take care of yourself, all you can bring to it is, and it's just going to be it's going to be a doppelganger of you, a mere shadowy reflection of you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very easy to get people emotionally involved in large-scale causes because it allows them to feel important, like their life has meaning and they're doing something important. And sometimes they are, but often not. Often, again, it's just a manipulation and abuse of other people's goodwill. So then 10 years go by, 15 years go by, whatever, and you're left with, you wake up and you say, where did my life go? What have I accomplished?
Mm-hmm.
And then you see true believer syndrome where, they just can't walk away. It's a bad relationship. It's not like one, it is a bad relationship. Right. So this is the notion of, we're asking the listeners to apply the notion of codependency, in that sense. What is codependency in terms of their spiritual beliefs, in terms of their political beliefs, in terms of all their associations? Is it essentially a codependent relationship? And within our community, most often it is. It's not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. I mean, we try to be healthy. Well, some people don't. Some people like to wallow in life in general, and complain. But suppose we have a bad day, all right, everybody has one. And all of a sudden you get sucked up into a very negative egregore situation. And you may not know that you have because, we all kind of slip up and, do the pity party thing and whatever, but that thing sticks to you, right? So how do we know it's there in order to get rid of it? Because it will be having an effect on our lives, but we may not understand why.
Well, you know it's there because you're miserable and you don't know why. You know, you keep going through the same patterns over and over again and nothing changes. Mm-hmm. Or you're denying reality. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the guy, it's the person who does, you know, the love ritual over and over and over again, but can't find anyone because, you know, they're too needy. Mm-hmm. You know, they're expecting that person to fulfill them, and they can't. They're bringing nothing to the relationship except more of the same. The person who's, you know, doing wealth rituals, but, you know, doesn't want to get a job. Yeah, I know the job doesn't pay well. I get it. Everyone knows that at some point in their life, and often at times in their lives when they'd rather not. Right. But at the same, but you do what you need to do to move forward, and that's where that denial of reality, that denial of what's actually happening, is again the social control mechanism of the groups and the thinking and the thought forms that we create within ourselves that then are amplified. Do you understand? Then they're amplified with the people that we are around. And then it becomes a virtual, you know, prison house of thought if we're not careful. Or it becomes a wonderful channel of opportunity. And I talked about that in the book as well, that you can create good groups.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's again, the duality comes up. You can do one way or the other, yeah. But okay, so because the egregores are the result of a collection of many. Now, suppose we as an individual decide to get rid of it. Will that destroy just our part or everyone's?
Well, for the most part, just ours.
Okay.
You know, because we separate out. Depends on how big it is. Now, you know, for example, you're not going to destroy the collective awareness of, you know, your PTA, okay, something benign like that, or your local Rotary group. It's bigger than you, okay, and it has greater influence and connection than you, but you can't sever your relationship with it. Now, let's look at, since most of your listeners are probably involved in some occult practices, and I use that term specifically, you know, so if you're getting together every week or every month or every other week with, you know, a bunch of friends, whether it's 3 people or 10 people, and you're having some kind of activity, you know, that activity might be very beneficial. You might enjoy it a great deal. It might actually help you in your journey. At other times you may think it is, but it's not. You know, you have to decide that. Can you then destroy it? You probably can't, but we have seen that these kind of groups are very fragile to begin with. So any kind of movement towards destabilizing them tends to have a powerful effect. The leader, of course, is always the focal point. So the leader, whoever he or she happens to be, will always have the most power in the group. And they have the greatest influence to see whether the group succeeds or fails, continues to live, or is destroyed.
Okay. Another comment in the chat room. She said, it sounds like Buddhist meditation would dispel it by detachment Reiki too. Are there practices which are normally immune to egregores?
A detachment allows you to recognize it and allows you to, in a sense, separate out as best you can, depending on your relationship or social situation with it. You know, some egregores you can't really completely separate out from. And the operative word there is completely, such as your neighborhood. As long as you're physically in that neighborhood, you're always going to be part of it. The country you live in. Now, depending on the size of the country, you know, it's going to be slightly different in each place. But your meditation is to help you become more aware of influences that are happening, both within your own mind and from outside. But that doesn't necessarily keep you from not being influenced by it. It just allows you to recognize the influence, and then you have to decide how you're going to respond to it. See, that's the next step. How do I respond to it? I recognize this isn't good for me, but I keep doing it anyhow. You see, okay, well then, okay, you see, then you can do all the detached meditation you want, but then it's what people forget is, like confession. One of the first things in Vajrayana, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, in Vajrayana, is Vajrasattva. You do the confessions and the purifications. And, in Kabbalah for Health and Wellness, my book, I talk about the importance of purification and confession. Most groups don't really have that. And most neo-pagan and Wiccan groups that are out there don't really have this in them. This notion that I really have to look at myself and do a purification, and then get rid of those bad habits that I have. Never do them again. I'm not going to do this anymore. That's part of it. It's not just enough to recognize it. You have to now take action.
Yeah. Question, and it says Egregore Tulpa are dark magic?
Oh, no. They're just magic. They can be anything we want. There's very good egregores out there. There's some wonderful ones. Now, their duality, all egregores are they're giant beings. They're giant living beings. Just as a corporation is considered a living being by the laws of the countries, a egregore is essentially the same thing. It's an invisible corporation. And it has a life cycle, a beginning, a middle, and an end, which just may be so large we can't conceive of it. But there's some very good ones.
Mm-hmm. And, we often hear the phrase, as above, so below, and egregores exist at both ends of the spectrum and everywhere in between. So, it's just like... Exactly,
yes.
You can't put it all, you can't get your head wrapped around it because it's that big, that much.
Yes, and this is a scary subject. We talked about this before the show, and many people have talked to me about it after the shows, after we hang up, say, oh, geez, how scary this is. I said, it is, but that's okay. That's part of being an adult, part of growing up in the universe. Now, you've had wonderful experiences. Just think of all the wonderful things you had. Maybe it was summer camp when you were a kid. Maybe it was, being in Girl Scouts, or something like that, or Boy Scouts. People have great experiences in that. I remember as a child, I had a wonderful time at summer church school for the week or two that we go there in the morning. It was a wonderful experience.
Mm-hmm.
So we have good group experiences. We have good egregores.
And it's up to us to make them good.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, bring in the human element, and that makes it very difficult.
That's where the self-honesty is required.
Right. So how does one develop that?
What, self-honesty?
Yeah, because, we just don't want to fess up to what we see in the mirror, and we don't want to admit to it. So how do you get honest with yourself? Generally. I'm not talking about everybody, but generally.
By fessing up to it. That's the reality of it. You got to sit, in the Pythagorean mysteries and in the schools I was brought up in, at night you'd have to do a nightly review of what you did across the day and say, okay, well, that was okay, that was good, could have handled that a little better, I'll change that, that was fine, I'll do that again in the future. And you have to do that. You have to really look at your life and how you're living, how you're thinking, and how you're responding to things. Mm-hmm. And if you find yourself getting jerked around by what you see on social media or what someone says, and you just have immediate emotional reactions, notice the word is a reaction, not a response, then that's an area to really just, take some time and separate out from.
Well, it's our human nature to shoot ourselves in the foot every chance we get, just because that's the way we're made, but it doesn't have to be.
And what you're talking about there, which is wonderful, is the function of habit. We're goal seeking. Our I think it was Maxwell? Was it Schmaltz, the author of Psychocybernetics? He said, the unconscious is a goal seeking mechanism, and that's really why people are so attracted to group activity, because they want a goal activity, they want a sense of feeling important, which is okay. They want to achieve things, they want to do things meaningful with their lives, which is good. But in that process, they can too often, not just as part of the learning process, but too often get in the habit of surrendering responsibility. So, we have to just look at, say, if we're doing things over and over again that are being good to us and helpful to us, we have to recognize that. And if we're doing things over and over again that are not beneficial to us, we have to recognize that. And then we have to change that. It's that simple. That's what all these spiritual teachings are fundamentally about. so that we can become self-aware. No one empowers you. That's nonsense. It's self-aware and self-empowered.
Well, that's when I said, it's in the nature of human beings. Kat in the chat room said, is that our nature or is it a mindset? That makes good sense.
Yeah. It's just a function of habit that we have built into it. So just like you can tie your shoelaces, so that you don't have to think about it. We create other habits. Habits make the character. That's just was Plato said something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things in the book that you say is that for anyone on a spiritual path, and that's any sort of spiritual path, being introduced to the concept of egregores is often a life-changing encounter. Now that sounds very positive.
Well, it is, because suddenly you look at your group in a whole new light. You recognize that half a dozen people or dozen people that you're meeting up with on a night like tonight to do some kind of meditation or prayer work or ritual work or whatever it happens to be, you now begin to recognize that this isn't just make-believe. It isn't just pretend. That something is going on here on many levels. So you then can say, is it what I was promised? Is belonging to this group, this order, this entity, this school, is it delivering what it promised? The same thing with the political movements that seem to be the obsession of too many in the spiritual community these days. Is it actually delivering the utopia you promised? No, it's not. But then you have to get honest about that. Honest, and so really honesty. You have to be honest with yourself. And the problem is people get into spirituality for not the best of reasons, and they may feel a little guilty about that. And I say no. That's perfectly honest, because I don't believe anyone gets into spirituality for the best of reasons. They don't do it because they want to actualize themselves. They do it because life is hard or difficult, or it just outright sucks. They're in pain and suffering, and they want to end it. That's really why we go into these practices.
Well, true, but spirituality can be very life-changing once you get that, because I think people mix up spirituality and religion. They're two separate entities, I think. And although you can be spiritual if you're religious, I'm not saying that, but it's just one of those things where you just have to kind of look for a path or look for an out. I mean, this whole world is messed up, and we can buy into it, or we can try and make a difference or change it in our own lives. I don't think we can change anybody else, because a lot of people walk around with blinders. But by getting to understand what we've been talking about tonight and becoming more spiritual and everything, I can see where it would be life-changing.
Yeah, and speaking about that, I mean, you want to make a difference. Stop getting involved in these big movements or trying to do, great social projects. Go clean up your neighborhood playground. Do things like that. Get involved in things where you actually can make a difference and you can see it and move on.
Yeah.
And see, that often is very difficult and very small, and people don't want to do that, but it's also very important. Like I said, we just did our conference 2 weeks ago. We do it every year. I don't want to stuff the gift bags for the attendees. I don't want to have to call all my publishers and ask them to donate stuff for the gift bags. I have a family to take care of, okay? But I do it. That's the small stuff.
Yeah.
And it's important small stuff, because it makes a difference. And this is what egregores are teaching us. The small things add up to big things.
Yeah.
That's why we have to carefully recognize our thoughts, our actions, and our words, and the community and the people that we're with, and making sure that everything is congruent. And that congruency is de facto self-awareness and self-mastery.
And I think when you do something and see the end result in your hand, it empowers you to do more and opens up more doors for you. You're not going to sit behind the veil there and just kind of piss and moan.
Exactly. This is what I was saying about, and I don't mean to cut you off, I know we're short on time, but that's what I was saying about the person who wants to get rich. You don't do a money spell to get rich. You do a career spell, you do a money spell, and you get a job. You don't just sit there getting a spell for relationships. You got to get out of your house. You got to meet people, and you got to ask your friend, what do I need to do about myself? What do I need to change about myself to be more attractive to other people on all levels? And that's what it's about. So like when I wrote 28 or 28 or 30 books, I don't even know. I've got 5 more lined up to get published. It's how do you do that? One word at a time, one article at a time, one small book at a time, one bigger book at a time. And success builds on success, but then failure also builds on failure. So we want to align ourselves constantly with successful people, successful attitudes, successful activities in all areas of our life. And that's where we're taking this group mind and this notion of the egregore and taking it to our advantage and not being taken advantage of by someone else's.
That makes really good sense. And as you said, we are running quickly down, so this might be a good time to let everybody know where they can find you, where they can find your books, and give a little information about the Institute for Hermetic Studies, too.
All of the books can be found on Amazon. That's the best way. Just look up Mark Stavish or Institute for Hermetic Studies. Also, we can be found, just Google Institute for Hermetic Studies. It's hermeticinstitute.org for those who would like to just type in the URL. And there's contact emails throughout that. We also have a blog known as Vox Hermes, and you can find that, of course, easily on a Google search. And contact us, and you'll get information about our activities, which is our big conference, which we hold once a year.
And you've got a lot of things on the Institute website. I mean, your blog is there, calendar of events. You have audios of past lectures. A lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff for people to get involved with and learn about.
There's a tremendous amount of information available for them to download, just at the cost of their internet connection.
Yeah. No, I didn't get a chance. I kept saying, I got to go back. I bookmarked it because I kept looking at things and, no, I got to do this. Okay, I'll get back there. So, it sucked me in never mind. Anyway.
That's what it's meant to do.
Yeah, it did. So I really want to thank you for sharing your book with us. And hopefully you'll pop in again sometime down the line to talk about some of your other books, because I've had a look and a couple of them really interest me. So hopefully someday you'll be up and ready to jump back in.
Anytime. Just let me know, and we'll set some time aside and we'll chat.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening in tonight. And until next time, everybody, blessed be and merry meet again. Good night.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Stirring the Cauldron with Marla Brooks. Please join us again next week at the same time for another great guest and more cauldron stirring. Any rebroadcast or other use of this program without explicit permission is strictly prohibited. Copyright 2019. The Mysterioso March by Kevin MacLeod is licensed through Incompetech.com.